Welcome to Extra Take. Lester Maddox was an interesting guy. In his time as the governor of Georgia, he hired more black staff members than all other Georgia governors before him combined. This was in the 60s, so that's not saying much, but credit where credit is due. For that fact, he was viewed as a traitor by many racist whites in his state. I recently watched an interview with Jim Brown and Lester Maddox, and in that interview, Maddox says that it is morally wrong and goes against God to argue that one race is superior or inferior to any others. This guy almost sounds like a progressive, except he was a segregationist, but in a way you might not expect. His philosophy on segregation is to preserve races. God created black people, white people, brown people, all kinds of people. And Lester thought it would be wrong if, one day, those races disappeared from everyone mixing together. Like in the episode of South Park with the time-traveling people from the future, the idea of preserving your culture through your skin color, it almost sounds like a woke idea, but not really. In his time as a business owner, Lester Maddox ran a whites-only restaurant. He personally didn't want the mixing of whites and blacks culturally in the same space, not just whites and blacks having children together. But at the same time, he didn't have any personal problem with a business or school that did not segregate. This all sounds contradictory, but it's not exactly. According to Lester, it would be morally cruel and unconstitutional to pass a law saying that segregation was mandatory. But he also said it would be equally morally cruel and unconstitutional to make segregation illegal, because to him, it has to be up to individuals' choice whether or not they want to segregate. Freedom, or more appropriately, liberty, means that you have the freedom as a business or university or whatever to allow blacks and whites, or the freedom to only let whites in. While as a matter of principle, there's actually some truth to that, I don't at all support this because it does nothing to help shift the moral conscience of our country. The argument also goes that making segregation illegal is a case of the government using force or violence, which is also unconstitutional, because if segregation is illegal, you will be arrested or fined or have your business, which is your personal property, taken away from you. So is making segregation illegal antithetical to the Constitution? Well, in a way, yes. But while segregation gives a business the freedom to choose, it removes the freedom for people in public to choose. Rights are given to one and taken from the other. Questions like this are weird because at some level, you almost have to take a hypocritical stance. Again, let me be clear, I don't agree with Lester Maddox at all. Even staunch defenders of the Constitution today are extremely unlikely to support the idea of segregation. This video is about arguments that have not aged well over time and being on the right side of history. There's a logical argument for segregation being constitutional, but that clearly has not aged well, because 50 years after this interview, segregation is deeply unpopular. It's almost unthinkable. However, as I watched this video, I was taken aback by how incredibly similar these 50-year-old arguments still are to the arguments made today over other social issues. We'll stick with segregation for a second. Peter Schiff is a well-known businessman who predicted the 2008 financial crisis. Peter is a hardcore libertarian free market capitalist. Unrestricted free market capitalism should be the only game in town, according to Schiff. On principle, Schiff would never run a segregated business. He would boycott a segregated business. But on principle, he thinks they should be allowed. I've heard him say this on the Joe Rogan podcast before, and I was just taken aback. I don't think he's at all racist, but to him, unlike Maddox, liberty means you have the freedom to conduct your business however you want. The additional argument goes something like, the government can't tell customers where they have to shop, so why should the government also be able to tell businesses what customers they have to accept? I hear these arguments and all I can think is, Well, yes, but actually no. Again, my main issue with this is that it ensures that racism, which Peter is against, perpetuates. If you allow segregation, it catches on in places and becomes more and more common. Now, I don't think the whole nation would all of a sudden revert back to pre-civil rights days, but Mississippi definitely would. Let's look at Lester's 50-year-old, badly aged arguments in the context of other modern-day arguments that I assert will also not age well in 50 years. The Supreme Court very recently ruled that businesses cannot fire LGBTQ employees based on their identity as LGBTQ. Here's one of the main right-wing libertarian arguments against the Supreme Court's ruling.
And again, I'm coming from the perspective that I generally don't think that gays and lesbians should be fired for being gay or lesbian. Right? I would hire a transgender person in my business. I would. Okay? I don't really care. Doesn't make a difference. You can do the job, you can do the job. But I also recognize that the government does not have the fundamental right to invade other people's property rights on behalf of a principle that I think about how somebody should run their business.
This is the exact same argument for segregation. I'm almost certain that Ben Shapiro would not support the idea of segregated schools or businesses, but he's using a segregationist's argument. This argument will be remembered for being on the wrong side of history. Speaking of LGBTQ rights, here's Lester Maddox talking about man betraying God's law.
Well, I agree with that, but
the Supreme Court goes outside the Constitution. That doesn't make the Supreme Court right, does it?
Don't you believe to have an affluent society, we've all chose to live in a society together. Don't you believe that to preserve that society that we need laws of the land? That's why we have a society. And we cannot make exception to these laws just because a person happens to be black or white. Don't you believe that?
We've got most of these laws because we don't abide by the laws of God, though. And so we try to go against the laws of God and against the laws of nature.
Because God says so is an argument used repeatedly to oppose gay marriage, but it's used for all kinds of other things. It was used to oppose interracial marriage because, again, God supposedly created the different races, and it would be wrong for us to mix them, undoing God's plan. That idea has not aged well. But I've also heard people argue that we shouldn't do anything about climate change because God will take care of us, and there will always be 4 seasons because God created the world and God is perfect. What I find that people constantly do is they take what they like or they defend their position from the perspective that they believe in God. They'll attach God to anything and everything they can. For example, Peyton Manning, who I love, said at the end of his retirement speech, "God bless football." The idea that God could possibly care about a bunch of millionaires giving each other brain damage is such a selfish and self-serving thing to say. So that was just an additional example, but the main argument here is using God to justify fighting against marriage equality. This argument will also be remembered for being on the wrong side of history. Muhammad Ali is remembered for many things, but a major one is he was a social revolutionist. Ali was drafted for the Vietnam War, but he refused to serve. Today, citizens cannot be drafted, so the idea of conscripting somebody into going off to die for their country has already been defeated. It's unconstitutional. So Ali is on the right side of history. But just listen to how Lester Maddox attacks Ali by clutching his pearls and using the military as a pawn piece to push his political opinion.
Here's a man that has said, well, here I want to fight in the ring for money, but I won't even wear the uniform of my country. He says that I can't do this, but in other words, I'm going to act different from these other people who stand up for their country and put on the uniform. Had they not fought for this country, if they were not even fighting today and wearing this uniform, that he could not even get in a ring and fight and be a free man to fight.
This sounds exactly like the attacks on Colin Kaepernick and other sports players who kneel during the national anthem. Blah, 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 the military, how dare you, so on and so on. This argument will not age well. Now listen to Jim Brown talk about the mission within the civil rights movement to push for employment rights for blacks. Then pay careful attention to Lester Maddox's rebuttal.
Believe it or not, I don't think that integration should be the number one thrust of our civil rights leaders anyway, because I think what we're really talking about in this country is economic development of black people. Because I've found
economic development of all people.
Well, we're talking about underprivileged
How come just
people.
black people? How come you don't want to do it for black people? How come you don't want to do it for white people?
I'll tell you why.
Huh?
I'll tell you why.
How come you don't want to do it for everybody? How come you always black people? Why don't you talk about all people?
Can I give you an answer?
I think we understand the question.
Yeah.
Can I give you an answer?
Here's the same argument in present-day America.
Black lives matter, period. And so I would yield to any of my colleagues on the Republican side who can unequivocally say, as we calibrate where we are right now, that black lives matter.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. Does the gentleman believe that all lives matter as well? I think black lives matter. I think all
Reclaiming
lives
my
matter.
time. Can anyone on the Republican side say unequivocally black lives matter?
Unequivocally, all lives matter. Why is that a problem to acknowledge?
Reclaiming my time.
All lives matter is the same argument that people who were against the civil rights movement used. Blacks were the ones who had fewer freedoms than whites. That's why there was the emphasis on their employment rights. Of course there should be equality for everyone, but this refusal to stand with the fight for the oppressed side's rights is just sticking your head in the sand and not acknowledging that they are oppressed. This argument will go down as being on the wrong side of history. I said this in a pretty recent video, but what exactly is wrong with being on the right side of history? The collective conscience of our country in the past was not very good by our standards. And I'm not exactly accusing people who argue in the same way as I've presented here as having the same moral character as maybe despicable figures from the past. But I do think it is important to point out that the way they think, the way they form their opinions, is flawed. And it is rooted in the way those people from the past also formulated their arguments. Pointing out these bad arguments is a way for us as a culture to improve ourselves, to correct for mistakes in the past, and to build a better future. We should all want that for ourselves. Thanks for watching.